দিদি ইয়ে বন্ধ হচ্ছে, আমি হোয়াটসঅ্যাপে তো বলে
বলো
দিচ্ছি।
বলো বলো বলো। আচ্ছা, কিসের?
তাহলে কি করবি? হ্যাঁ বল। হ্যাঁ আমি, তুই এটা কর না, কর, কিছু হবে না। হুম, হুম, হুম।
শুরু করবো তাহলে? আচ্ছা। Good afternoon and cordial welcome to everyone to the third session of the webinar series organized by Jadavpur Government College on interpretation of survival strategies of nature and human amidst pandemic and natural disaster. Participants on Google Meet are requested to mute their microphone and participants on YouTube Live are requested to leave their questions. After 15 to 20 minutes, the lecture will start. We have already enjoyed two fantastic sessions. First one was on 11th July by Professor Soumitra Basu and second session was on 30th July by Dr. Maitri Chakraborty. Today we are grateful to have Dr. Amites Mukhopadhyay as our speaker. He is the professor of the Department of Sociology, Jadavpur University. His research interests include the sociology, social anthropology of environment and development in South Asia, with particular focus on coastal India and deltaic borderlands. Competing perspectives on development and resource use, governance, state-making, and discourse of civil society in Indian context. Today, Dr. Mukhopadhyay will talk on vulnerable yet resilient people, cyclones, embankments, and the Sundarbans. It is our great pleasure and honor to have you, sir, among us. Now, may I request you, sir, to present your lecture, please.
Thank you, Rini, for this very warm invite to everybody at Jadavpur College to have me on board. Something which relates to our times, quite difficult and yet struggling and surviving. Although I have the slide in front of me, which reads vulnerable yet resilient people, cyclone embankments and the Sundarbans, but I thought I would title my lecture or my sharing with you what happens in the Sundarbans. It's primarily keeping that in mind, I decided to have the title uh, Vulnerable and Resilient People, Cyclone in the Time of a Pandemic in Sundarbans. Now, before I get on with what I intend to share with you all, maybe a quick look at what probably a place which is known to many of us might seem repetitious to many who are present here today, but it is also a place which might not be known to people who might be here today with us. So at the cost of being repetitive, let me just quickly sort of look at what this place is, the Sundarbans. Can I have slide 2, please? In a very common parlance, Sundarbans, as we know, is a mangrove delta which lies to the south of Bengal in post-partition India, West Bengal. Earlier, a place which was both together India and today's Bangladesh, together the unpartitioned Bengal Delta, which was largely a group of islands and archipelago by the confluence of the Ganges, Meghna, and Brahmaputra, with their innumerable, creeks and channels and tributaries and distributaries. Ganga Brahmaputra Delta stretches over several miles from the shoreline Orissa to those of Chittagong and Burma in the east, which was a major, frontier region, which was animated by opposing flows of water, fresh water sort of hurtling all the way down from the Himalayas towards Bay of Bengal, and salt water stinging up with the tide of the Indian Ocean into the Bengal hinterland. Can I have the third slide, please? A satellite image of Sundarbans. To slide number 4, please. Gives us a kind of a sense of what this place is all about, with the rivers basically crisscrossing, creating its own, land surfaces as it goes along, eating into some lands and allowing lands to emerge at other ends, and that's how it's a kind of a mesh of a river, canals, creeks, which kind of flow across Bangladesh and to its west, the West Bengal of today's India. Slide number 10, please. Roughly, the region encompasses an area of about 25,500 square kilometers, 2/3 of which lie in Bangladesh and 1/3 in India. The line which demarcates, kind of makes the boundary of Sundarban, marks it off on the non-Sundarban parts, is what is still today known as the Dampier-Hodges line. Can I have quickly the slide number 13, please? Now, if you look at this, then the region which lies to the north of this Bengal Delta, if we look at simply Sundarban of West Bengal in India, then the line which sort of goes across, the northernmost sort of a boundary that it sets Sundarban apart from the rest of non-Sundarban parts, is what was surveyed as by Dampier and Hodges, the two surveyors, in the early 1830s, and that still remains the major distinguishing kind of a line, imaginary line, beyond which lies the non-Sundarban parts, and to the south of that line lie the entire, forested and the settled islands of the Sundarban Delta, and the line eventually goes into Bangladesh. Because originally the surveyed area was pre-partition Bengal, eventually the line continues even when the partition had eventually become the reality for most of us in South Asia. This is, can we just quickly go back to the slide number 10, please? Now, this is a kind of a very fast moving saline, watery surface, which is known all over the world for the last remaining natural habitat of the mangroves, as well as the Bengal tiger, roughly a home to about 600 of them. In 1973, the Tiger Project was instituted in the Sundarbans, and Sundarban entered in the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources list of World Heritage Sites in the decade of the 80s. If we could move to 11, slide number. Interestingly, Sundarban is also an abode of the humans, because normally the image that conjures up in our minds when we invoke Sundarbans or when we talk about Sundarbans is that it's a hugely forested delta with which kind of an heritage site for its unique natural properties, wildlife, so on and so forth. But it is also a place for the humans. It's a home to about 5 million people, about which almost 2.5 million live on the islands which lie to the south of the delta, closer to the forested islands. It is about Bengal Sundarban, by which I mean the West Bengal part of the Sundarban, Indian Sundarban, has 102 islands, of which 54 are kind of settled islands, and the rest are reserved for tigers. Roughly the social profile, if you could have, quickly to have a look at 16 and 17 slides. Slide number 16, please. This is roughly, I'm not getting into the detail of this, but this is roughly the kind of a block-wise distribution of population. Today, Sundarban is spread over the erstwhile 24 Parganas got split into two of its districts, south and north, and Sundarban is spread across these two districts with about 19 blocks, 6 from north 24 Parganas and 13 from south. And this is roughly the population figure block-wise, which gives us a sense of what these populations are, which is largely, population migrated from Bangladesh, pre-partition Bengal, partition Bengal, in different parts of West Bengal, Midnapur, and other places. But largely, it is a kind of a home to all this migrant population who have come in and settled on these different islands. Now, the question that arises at this point is that, what this place is then. It is a place which is both a combination of its forested islands and the settled islands, where the forests, which are lying closer to the Bay of Bengal, further south, are the islands which are which disappear underwater every 6 hours during high tide, and they re-emerge when the water has started to retreat. And similarly, when the water goes up during high tide, the settled islands look almost like a kind of a basin, which almost the water rising up to its huge embankments built around these settled islands. Uh, and as soon as the water starts to retreat, the islands kind of, they wake up, as it were, and emerge as though they were in slumber. And there's a constant, kind of a dialogue between this forested and the and the settled islands as the water, travels in and around them, um, you know, making dialogue possible at one point and almost impossible at the other. And the points when every 6 hours the islands are barely seen from from a boat, when the water rises, forests go under the water, and suddenly they kind of, come back as though they resurface as the water retreats during low tide. Um, and this is something which makes for the unique topography and the unique, landscape of a place where the rivers and the lands, they have sculpted the landscape and the topography of this deltic region. Um, just to give you a very quick sort of a tour, if we could call it a tour at all, in this uh, very unexpected, unanticipated time, probably this could be the best tour that we could possibly have of the Sundarbans. Can I have quickly the slide number 5, please? From a boat, if you are, sort of, um, cruising along, um, um, it's within an island, where you have this canal being created, where the river mouth, is been connected, and the saline water is allowed in, where there is some fishing can take place. Slide number 7, please. This is once again a very sort of a familiar feature of a floodplain created on the river. When you have the embankment quite in the distance, but what you could see ahead of the embankment, as if you are standing on an embankment, then what you could see is the floodplain beyond which you have the river. Slide number 8, and then to slide number 9, which quickly gives us a sense of people's movement, on the embankment, and people kind of, go down the slope of the embankment to sort of get on the boats for transportation moving across. If we quickly have, 14, which tells us also the movement of not only people but also movement of livelihoods, the kind of activities that go on an everyday basis. Slide number 15, please. Movement of people once again, which gives us a kind of a sense of who these people are, how they sort of navigate this, terrain and topography and the landscape, and how they negotiate, a place which they have kind of domesticated, kind of almost, made their own over the years. If we now could, get to the question with which I intend to sort of, share with you some of my thoughts, which had largely come in the wake of the cyclone, which occurred in the month of May this year. Um, uh, if you think of the cyclone Amphan, then the question that arises in all of our minds is that Cyclone Amphan was not the only one that struck Sundarban. In fact, this is a place which we often find that it figures in the news when there's a cyclone that has struck the region. And there are, plenty of them. If we, look the recorded history of cyclones in the region, then you would find just give me a second. If we look at the long list of cyclones that happened in the region, then you'll find that there are simply countless number of cyclones. For example, I'm just quickly trying to sort of get to the cyclones that struck the region. Just bear with me. If we just have a look at the long list of cyclones that happened in that region, Cedar in 2007, Ayla, one of the biggest and the strongest, 2009, Falin 2013, Hudhud 2014, Bulbul 2019, and then we have Amphan in 2020. When I started my work in the Sundarbans way back in 1999 2000, the only cyclone that I could get to hear, which kind of rolled off people's tongue whenever we met people for a discussion or for an interview, it was the cyclone of 1988, which struck the region in the month of Ashin, which is roughly the beginning of November, end October. That was a time when the harvest was almost nearly sort of complete, and when the cyclone happened, and it killed about 10,000 people in the Sundarbans. And that cyclone, which didn't have a name, because we never, because it happened in 88 when we were not in the regime of cyclone being named even before they hurtled and made a landfall. So it was a cyclone of 1988 which was devastating and which set kind of people, government, NGOs, whoever were working in the region, thinking as the little works that they have been doing all these years could go down the drain in about a couple of hours. And this was something that set people thinking. And this is something that we were kind of confronted with moment I went to Sundarbans. That this was a kind of a cyclone that goes into the recorded history as ranking as one of the severest and the fiercest cyclone that Sundarban had ever witnessed. And then, we are into the next century and countless number of cyclones. In fact, Sundarban is not unfamiliar with cyclones. But then what is it that makes Amphan so very unique and recurrent, both at the same time? I would talk about the uniqueness first and then move on to the recurrence. Now, what is it that makes Amphan so very unique? To my mind, Amphan's happening, the time of its occurrence is what makes it somewhat unique. And finding in a pandemic its natural ally. When in March, with almost a couple of days notice, with almost without any planning, a lockdown was announced. Sundarban was facing a difficult time. Why difficult? Because Aila in 2009, one of the severest before Amphan came, one of the severest cyclone that struck Sundarbans. Of course, people killed during Aila were probably much less than that in the case of a 1988 cyclone. But devastation was severe. And Aila's devastation simply led people to leave Sundarbans, caused people to out-migrate for work elsewhere in India, in Kolkata, in Chennai, in Mumbai, in Bangalore, in Port Blair, every metropolis could feel the the impact of the migrants coming, who were absorbed obviously by this huge informal sector, which accounts for almost 70 to 80%, which includes a whole lot of occupations, starting from construction to you could name all kinds of population, ranging from construction to many others, including a kind of a dwindling agricultural sector. They were absorbed in this huge informal sector, which could still serve as a major backbone to India's economy. The sector, no matter how exploitative it was, could still be the option, and a very significant option, for people who were homeless because of a cyclone that lasted a few hours. All the major able members of the families on different islands had to leave homes. Some of them who were in the vicinity of Kolkata would perhaps come back during their break, and some were very infrequent, as far as coming back home was concerned. Aila happened in 2009, and in 2010-11, Sundarban already wore a very, very deserted look. In fact, a publication which was brought out by a few well-meaning people called Sundarban Bashir Shathe, with the people of the Sundarbans, who had made a detailed survey of the Sundarban in the aftermath of Aila, and they came out with a kind of an evidence that most of the male members, female members, in the age set of 20 to 40 practically left their homes in search of livelihood elsewhere, because Sundarban failed to provide any livelihood. And these were the people who were so far absorbed by the informal sector, stood completely exposed of the sheer informality of the informal sector when the lockdown was announced. A lockdown which simply fired people at the will of the employer. Our friends and well-wishers who lived in the Sundarbans, people with whom we spent valuable quality time, started calling as to what would happen to them with no means of transport, with absolutely no means to survive. They were all finding their way back. And we all know the visuals that came on news, television, electronic media of the workers and the migrant laborers walking miles before they succumb to their exhaustion, succumb to the disease, got run over when they fell asleep on rail tracks, by train, which almost came from nowhere. Uh, Women carrying their children on shoulders, young mother lying dead on the railway platforms, with a toddler trying to wake her up, hardly realizing, that mother was no more. Now, this was the kind of a larger backdrop when people were forced to sort of find their way, when we know that, the transport planes and other important, modes of communication were arranged to bring the overseas people, nothing was done for people stranded in the informal sector. This was a time when people were almost kind of on the verge of threshold, thinking that they would probably spend their life, or probably they will lose their life on the streets, on the highways, as they walk along in search of a destiny which was unknown to them. And this was a time when people were also heading towards Sundarban. It was a kind of a migration back, reverse to the Sundarbans. These were the people who were spread all across India, located in different cities, suddenly found that their jobs are no longer there, and they had to find their way back. And find their way back home, we all know that almost the whole of April was spent by these people traveling, walking from different destinations, when their states where they were working were not reluctant to sort of, keep them, whereas the states which were their home states, where they were supposed to come back, were also reluctant to allow them in, thinking that, such exodus might, induce a further spike in the infection and the disease. So it was as if this entire population, a majority of the Bengal population, were heading towards Sundarban as well, who were kind of caught in kind of a crossfires. Almost whole of April spent, and May, when they started to come back, mother who was working in Kolkata hospital, in some ill-reputed hospital as a kind of a nurse, was constantly trying to call her sons who were settled in Mumbai as they were heading towards Sundarbans, walking, sort of climbing onto loaded trucks, ignoring, the principles of physical distancing, which was a kind of an advisory to prevent the spread of the pandemic. They were all coming back to Sundarbans, coming back home to an uncertain future, to something about which they were completely ignorant as to what was in store for them. And it was on such a retreat well into May of 2020 that we had the forecast of this cyclone. The more distressing was the forecast that the cyclone was coming, hurtling at a great speed towards Sundarban, which lay in its path. And then the fateful night when the Amphan struck and lasted about 4 or 5 hours. The uniqueness of Amphan was that it kind of made the vulnerable completely sort of, as though they were living on the edge. A disaster that struck, people left homes, huddled in the cyclone shelters, thousands of them, crammed with people, women, children, without regard for sense of segregation, privacy, distancing to say the least. This was the uniqueness of Amphan, that it tied its knot with something about which the people of Sundarban were doubly jeopardized. The people who were there in the Sundarbans suddenly found they're without any jobs. Those who never migrated out worked in different informal sectors, primarily in the fisheries, in the tourist lodge that had mushroomed on these islands over the last few years. They suddenly found their jobs are no longer with them. In a sense, they were kind of face to face with their migrant counterparts, looking in each other's eyes with a sense of agony and anxiety as to what would happen to both of them, as though they are confronted with something which was bringing in disaster in exactly the same way as the earlier disasters did. And it is in this sense that I would call Amphan a recurrence as well. Why recurrent? It is because it brought in devastation and wreckage in exactly the same way as the earlier cyclones did. The cyclones that struck Sundarbans at different times. What is it that made
স্যার
একটু
দাঁড়াবেন, একটা প্রবলেম হচ্ছে, টেকনিক্যাল প্রবলেম হচ্ছে, ইউটিউবে 5 মিনিট একটু দাঁড়ান স্যার, একটু ওয়েট করুন। সরি ফর দ্য ইন্টারাপশন।